Fun.
Hey, awesome. I'm Jeremy, a product manager here at GitLab, and I'm here with Kathleen Tam to talk a little bit about data at GitLab. So, Kathleen, the topic that we're specifically talking about is this dashboard here in the dev section, where we have this XMAU section, and we have these kind of matrix of graphs talking about TMAU. So the one graph that we were talking about and getting a little confused by was this dev section TMAU paid SaaS chart. And you can see when we go in and edit and actually look at the chart itself, we have like manage is not currently included because we need like a technical definition to kind of redefine it. But then you and we started talking a little bit about what this chart, I asserted on Slack that is it even possible for us to get this information right now? Because right now this says dev section TMAU paid SaaS. And so that implies to me that we are taking all of our TMAUs for the section, and we are splitting it by paid namespaces versus free namespaces and only looking at the paid stuff. And as far as I know, like that's not actually possible and not something that we actually do. We definitely don't do in usage ping, and I don't know if we have queries to do it on like in the data warehouse from our GitLab.com like database snapshots. But like to me, that says that like okay, for plan, for instance, which looks at like the number of users creating issues, we would need to look at every single paid namespace and only look at the issues that were created in paid namespaces, which to me seems very like challenging from a query standpoint. So what I said in Slack was I would assert that looking at paid SaaS TMAU is not possible. But then I said it might be possible to look at like paid GMAU by SaaS. And that's based off of my dated understanding now that paid GMAU are actions that only are inherently paid. So like for access, it's like the MAU using paid SAML. So like if you see a group that is using paid SAML, it is inherently paid because it is a paid feature. Like if you look at plan certify, for instance, plan MAU interacting with requirements, same deal. Requirements is a paid feature. So if you just look at the MAU interacting with requirements and then look at SaaS, then you are looking at paid GMAU or paid TMAU when you roll it up to the section level, SaaS. So the two things that I now assert, one is that looking at TMAU by paid SaaS is not currently possible, so we should remove that chart. And then two, if we want to look at that, we should look at paid TMAU by SaaS, and that is something that we can actually measure. What do you think about those statements?
Yep, so I would say I might need some clarifications around some of the way that you're using your language. I know that at GitLab here, I've seen the word paid come up a lot of times. I will say that this paid is not the, potentially we'll need to continue to iterate on our definition of paid, but I'm happy to walk you through how this is defined and how to think about it. Sorry, I'm not sure if you're able to see my screen. I'm gonna go
I saw
ahead and
your
share.
desktop very briefly. And I think my
Is it
confusion is
mounted?
also sourced from the fact that like when we first talked about GMAU and paid GMAU, we
Yep.
did have like separate definitions for them. But when I look at the handbook now, it now says GMAU for paid namespaces. So I think that paid GMAU and paid TMAU definition is probably dated. But now my first assertion still like is accurate in my mind, which is like I don't know if we have a way of looking at paid GMAU for SaaS, because from what I understand, there's no query that I'm aware of that like splits GMAU activity by just paid namespace. It seems pretty challenging.
So we can, and that's what this part here is. What is the plan of that namespace on the date that that person performed the event? And so you'll see here if that plan at that time was a 2, that's a bronze plan. If it was a 3, it's a silver plan. And if it's 4, it's a gold plan. We are also in this case filtering out trial data, but I'll also show you how we do that. So this is the really nice thing about being able to import our GitLab.com data from the database, from the production database into our data warehouse. So I'm gonna go ahead and walk you a little bit through this table. So for this table, what it does is in this table, we first basically try to replicate the metric that was instrumented on usage ping if it came from a GitLab.com data source in our data warehouse. So for example, I recently did one for create where I think it's at the top, so it'll be easier for me to scroll to it. So here for create, they have one where they're trying to understand how many active users they have on the project repo. So for this, I've actually manually coded out what this looks like. So I'm going to Control F, find this. And you'll see here what I do is I say select all select all columns from the events table where this event is true. So I believe this action ID is whether or not someone has committed a new thing to the repository. So in the case of manage, I'm missing this information. And so we haven't actually codified it for the SAS for manage. But when we do get that kind of information, this is how we would put that in. Once we have all the information, what we then do in this query at the bottom, and so I'll scroll down here so you can kind of see how we're delineating the namespaces. But for each of these events that we've kind of coded, what we then do is we look at that namespace. So we know the user, we know what namespace that action happened from. And for this namespace, we do know whether or not it's tied to a plan, a paid plan or not. So for example, if it is a trial, then we say it's a trial, and then we give it a number of 34, which is free, because we do not want to count them with our paid plans. This can change, especially as we continue to evolve as a company. But for now, that's what it is. And otherwise, we're going to go ahead and use a plan ID if it's not a trial. And so that's how we kind of delineate the plan ID at event date. So that is this field again here. And if you filter on 2, 3, 4, you should only get namespaces of paid plans. Now, that being said, obviously this is at a paid namespace level. I am actually not tracking whether or not this feature is paid or not. We're just trying to say if this user is on a paid plan and they took an action that's related to that namespace. So for some data sets, if people have instrumented their features at a level that you can kind of map a user ID to that event, as well as a namespace to that event, then we are able to do this type of activity.
Cool. That's really helpful. Awesome. So tell me more about like why manage isn't included in this. Like it says that it's done in Redis. Is that something that we need to, is that a challenge where we need to model in DBT, or is there something else that we need to kind of do?
I think that's a great question. And that's why in the example that I provided one with create. So create also did Redis as well, but it really depends on the type of way that you're implementing Redis that will dictate whether or not we can easily replicate this or if it'll take more time. So let me go ahead and find the issue example. I think it's this one. Yeah. So in this example, I was speaking with James Ramsey, and I was explaining this similar logic to him and the way to get to this. And so the first thing I asked was, hey, James, if you have a metric, if this is by Redis, did you pull this data from a GitLab.com database table? So was this, even though it's a Redis counter, is it actually a query off the database table? And so he said, yes, it is. And so he pulled in Mark Shaw, who was great. Mark Shaw basically helped me to understand that the data does live in Redis, but it is a query off the events table. And therefore with that, he then gave me the queries to replicate. And so I basically took this query and I rewrote it in that one. So for the example of create, where I was showing that first example of the project repository, this was that where the event action was equal to 5 and the target type was null. And so now for manage, I need that same information. So for the manage metrics, if it is off of a database table, then I can easily replicate it. If you did it off of page views, that's where it gets harder. For page views, your mirror for SAS would actually be snowplow data.
Gotcha.
And then that's where it gets trickier. So if it is snowplow data, what we can do with snowplow data is that with snowplow data, I can definitely capture total views, total things like that. It is at this time not easy to get to a user ID or a namespace ID. It is, in my opinion, possible, but will require time and an investment from the data team, like a good month's investment.
Got it. Got it. Okay. That's really helpful. It sounds like there's some work that the manage team needs to do then to kind of help assist. So if you wouldn't mind like sending this issue to me in a DM, that would be super helpful.
Yep. I will go ahead and direct message it to you. Oops, I almost typed direct message. Let me find this. But I would say that eventually for snowplow, it will also be possible. And it's just a matter of taking time to build it out, working through our privacy policy, making sure there's no concerns there. But I would say all of this is possible. We're already tracking users for the most part. So this is how we would think through the problem. So it's not a problem of whether or not you do Redis. It's for Redis, how are you doing it? If it's based off of page views, that's where the counterpart would be Snowplow. And if it's not based off of page views, but rather a database event, then we can easily replicate that since we pull in the whole database to the data warehouse.
Sounds really good. I'm not really sure. I know that we implemented a new method on the controller in order to capture these page views and usage ping. So I'll have to go back to the analytics team. So
Agreed.
thanks. That was really helpful. So in summary, I learned a couple of things today. I learned, number one, that the distinction between GMAU and paid GMAU is no longer based off of a separate definition for these, because now we have the ability to actually look at a namespace level and model that into our data, which is super exciting. So it's no longer a requirement to have separate definitions for them to measure paid activity. At one point it was, but that's no longer the case. Number two, the kind of discrepancy that we see is one that is kind of unique to manage, but it's something that our team can work with you to try to kind of resolve. So I'll take a look at that issue, create it, and kind of go from there. But it seems like both of my statements at the start of this call were invalidated, and we actually can measure paid, like TMAU, paid SaaS activity. It's just a question of updating and modeling the data so that we can actually measure it based off what you showed me. So cool. Sounds really good. Thanks for the clarity.
Thank you for the call. I do have to say that Jerome and I will continue to work to make this more and more clear. I think what gets confusing sometimes is we have two different types of Snowplow implementations, one that goes for our SaaS and then one that is for our self-managed. And then also with the different types of ways of doing it, the data team is looking for ways to work around and really build out that whole understanding of our user, whether they're on a self-managed instance, whether they're on our SaaS product, how to view them from as many angles as possible.
Cool. Yeah, awesome. Excited to see us continue to improve and iterate here. But thanks for the great work, Kathleen, as always.
Thank you too. Thank you and your team. Really appreciate the help. Thank you.
Cool. Awesome.